All right, so by now, I hope you guys know the three kinds of neurons. First one's motor, and it carries information which way? Motor neurons, which way are they carrying information? Away from the brain and the spinal cord, right? Away from the central nervous system. Sensory ones do the opposite. They carry information to the central nervous system, rather. And an interneuron, in some cases, will connect the two together directly, skipping what? Skipping the brain. And what do we call that kind of scenario? It's a reflex arc. By now, too, I hope you know the parts of your general neuron. The dendrites do what? Receive signals, incoming information. The soma, or the cell body, the part there in the middle, that's where all the organelles are, like the nucleus and ribosomes and such. And then you usually have one outgoing piece. It's called the axon. In most cases, it's surrounded by this fatty layer called what? Myelin sheath. It's a type of insulation, kind of like electrical insulation. But the kind of strange thing about it on first glance is it's got these little spots, like right in here, and eventually the markers will catch up with me, I think. Those little places where there's not hardly any insulation, and those are called nodes. And we'll get to the importance of those in just a second. But make sure you know the parts of a nerve. Also, make sure you know how to explain how a synapse works. A synapse, we know, is the connection between the axon of one nerve and the what of the next one? The dendrite. And the way that works is we have an action potential coming down this first nerve, what we call the presynaptic neuron. Thought that was written up there, but maybe not. Is it at the bottom? Yes. Okay, it's down here. But anyway, this is the presynaptic neuron. We've got an action potential. And we'll talk more about action potentials in a minute, but essentially they're just what? What's an action potential? The electrical signal, the impulse, the electrical impulse. That impulse gets near the end of the neuron, near the end of the axon, and it calls what ion starts to flood into this neuron? Yep, calcium ions, Ca plus 2s. Or at least they're released within the neuron. And all those calcium ions eventually pretty much just push out what? The neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters get pushed out into the actual synapse, the gap. And they diffuse across. And on the postsynaptic neuron, which is this one on the other side, they bind to these little receptors in blue in my picture up here. We talked about this the other day. What kind of receptors are involved usually on the neurons? Ligand-gated ion channels. And we know from our cell signaling talk about 1,000 times that a ligand binds to a receptor, and what generally happens next? Conformational change. In this case, the shape changes, and what happens to the ion channel? It opens. And what starts to go in through that channel? Into the next nerve, into the postsynaptic neuron. What ion? Sodium ions start to rush in. So Na pluses rush into this nerve. And that's the beginning of what in that next nerve? The postsynaptic neuron. What does that start? The next, what's the word for that? What's the word for that electrical signal? Action potential. It starts the action potential in that next neuron. So it's more of that cell signaling stuff sort of tied in with the action potential stuff we talked about last time. Let's make sure you leave here today able to explain what an action potential is. We said that normally a neuron looks something like this. This is just a little stretch of a neuron. What ion is there a lot of inside the actual neuron? Potassium. K plus. And there's a lot of sodium on the outside. So there's a gradient. And what structure helps to maintain that gradient? Sodium, potassium, using what kind of transport process? Active transport. And in this condition, what adjective might we use to describe this neuron? Polarized. It's got one thing on the inside and another thing on the outside. It's polarized. This is when a nerve is ready to work. It's not doing anything right now, but it's ready to work. All right, something happens. Some neurotransmitters start to bind to this neuron somewhere. What kind of channels did we say open up? Ligand-gated ion channels, but channels for what ion? Sodium. They open up. Well, what's sodium going to do since there's a lot of sodium on the outside and not so much on the inside? It rushes in just by simple facilitated diffusion. It starts to rush in. Before we get to how that works, though, let's go up and look at this graph. Normally, a neuron starts off with a voltage, a potential of about -70. There's some negative charged things inside this neuron too, like fluorines, proteins. So the negatives actually outnumber the positives on the inside to begin with. That's what we call resting potential. It's when a nerve is just sitting there ready to go. All of a sudden there's a stimulus. Now in some cases the stimulus might be really, really small, and a few sodium channels might open, but not enough. So nothing really ever happens in this nerve. But if it's a big enough stimulus, a lot of sodium channels open, the voltage in there starts to go up because what's going in? Positive ions, sodiums. If the voltage gets above -55 millivolts, this thing goes all the way. That's called threshold. It's all or nothing. And in this first part of the graph on this left side, this is called depolarization. Because what's happening to our gradient on the left side of that graph? The sodiums are going in, what's happening to our ion gradient? It's going away, right? Because there were sodiums outside and potassiums inside. Well, now everything's going to be on the inside, right? Because the sodiums are going in. So it's depolarized. But that's moving ions. What are moving ions? It's electricity. This is how your nerves generate electricity. Well, the channels that we've been talking about for sodium and potassium, what tells them when to open and when to close? Other than neurotransmitters, what can cause channels to open or close? Or the gates controlled by? Voltage. They're called voltage-gated channels. So when the voltage gets up to about +40, that's the signal for the sodium channels to close. But it's also the signals for what else? When the sodium channels close, what happens to the potassium channels? They open. They're both controlled by voltage. So we get up here and the potassium channels open. And what's potassium going to do in the situation right here? It's going to go out because there's a lot in and not so much out. So potassium starts to go out. And the voltage starts to go back down. This side is called repolarization. Now the voltage, notice, drops a little bit below -70. This phase of the action potential is called the refractory period. During that phase, the nerve can't work. But what structure is working really hard to get us back to that resting potential? The sodium-potassium pump. It's pumping the potassiums back in, it's pumping the sodiums back out. It's trying to get back to the situation where we started. And notice this whole signal lasts only about 5 milliseconds, about 5/1000ths of a second. So it's happening really, 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 really fast. But it's all about the moving of ions and therefore the generation of electricity. And that's why we call sodiums and potassiums what? They're electrolytes, because they're ions that let us generate in our nerves electricity. Let's go to this picture here for just a second. Now let's talk about just that motor neuron right there. Let's say that this signal, these dendrites up here just received a signal, which caused sodiums to start to rush in here. Sodium in. So this is the beginning of an action potential up here around the soma. Does that action potential flow through this like water might flow through a pipe? It doesn't. The sodium channel's open here, which causes the voltage to go up. What does that cause to happen to the sodium channels at that first node? They open. The voltage there goes up. What does that cause to happen to the sodium channels at the next node? It causes them to open, which makes the voltage go up, which causes what to happen at the next node? They open, and it's like a domino effect. But the signal doesn't have to go through the whole nerve. It's jumping from what? Node to node to node to node to node, which makes it pretty wet. Makes it fast. That kind of nerve conduction is called saltatory conduction. When the nerve signal will jump from node to node to node to node to node, it makes it fast. We're not talking speed of light fast, not anywhere near that. We're talking fast. And that's why we need what? What allows that to happen? What creates the nodes? The sheath, the myelin, right? Makes our nerve conduction way faster than it would be without it. All right, that's probably the stuff I just went over with you. It's probably going to be 85% of the stuff on the nervous system test. And that's the stuff they're going to test you on. That's what the AP people are concerned if you know. Probably early next week. But let me go through just a couple other basic things you just need to know for your own purposes. I've got over here on the board, but I'm going to draw it on this board so that people watching the video can see it. Just sort of a flow chart of your nervous system. Everything starts at the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. But there's all kinds of nerves that branch off of those two structures. And those are called the PNS, where the P stands for what? Peripheral. What's peripheral mean? Yeah, like around, to the side. Peripheral nervous system is everything that branches off the brain and the spinal cord. That system is divided into two main parts. The autonomic and the somatic. We know somatic means what? Body. It's the conscious part of your nervous system. The stuff you can consciously feel or control. The autonomic, on the other hand, is the unconscious part. It's the part that controls things like your heart rate, your breathing rate, when your digestive organs are functioning, when your pupils are dilating or constricting. Think about how annoying it would be if you had to think about all those things. You don't. They happen autonomically or automatically. Now, the autonomic nervous system is also divided itself into two other divisions. And we're going to talk just a minute about those two divisions. Those are the sympathetic, which you can see spelled right there. I'll just abbreviate it here. Sympathetic. And the parasympathetic, which you can see written out right there. Those are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Those two parts work together to keep you where? Homeostasis in the middle. Notice that they're sort of antagonistic to each other. If the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the heart, it speeds it up. But if the parasympathetic stimulates the heart, it slows it down. If the sympathetic stimulates the air passages, they dilate. If the parasympathetic stimulates them, they constrict. So they do opposite things. Normally, these two are both working together to keep you somewhere in the middle, homeostasis. But if things go bad, which nervous system sort of takes over? The sympathetic, and it causes what response? Fight or flight. And what hormone helps to stimulate that part to really take over? Epinephrine, adrenaline. On the other hand, if things are really good and you just had you've got a full belly and life is nice and there's little stress, the parasympathetic sort of takes over. Let's look at another side of the picture. Here we're looking at different parts of your body. Notice the sympathetic part tends to slow down anything related to like digestion. Because if you're in danger, are you really worried about digestion? Those things are way to put on the back burner. The blood that had been flowing to the stomach and the intestines and other parts of the digestive system, where would that make more sense to send that blood if you're in danger? The heart, but more importantly, and the muscles, right? So you can run faster, run longer, be stronger. So the sympathetic nervous system tends to decrease digestive activity, whereas the parasympathetic tends to speed it up. Remember, under normal conditions, both of these systems are working together to keep you somewhere in the middle, somewhere around homeostasis. All right, the very last thing that we'll talk about are a few parts of the brain. Realistically, most of this stuff is not going to be on the AP exam because it's not about anatomy so much. It's just stuff you ought to know. This little structure back here in the back of your brain. Who can tell me what that's called? That is the cerebellum. Don't confuse that with the cerebrum. The cerebellum takes in information from your senses, like your eyes mostly, and then does what with that information? Yeah, it coordinates it with your motor movements, your muscle movements. So it helps you to hit a baseball, to throw a spear and hit whatever you're trying to hit with a spear, okay? Because everybody does that every day at home, right? Yeah, it's muscle coordination. Yeah. So don't go out and spear anything, because that would be bad. When you think of the cerebellum, think coordination of sense input and motor movement. We'll leave it at that. This big part of your brain, by far the biggest part of the brain in humans. What is that? That is the cerebrum. And that's where the things that make us human happen. Things like emotion, memory, consciousness, thought, voluntary movement, all the parts, all the things that we think of that we associate with being human happen in the cerebrum. And as you go down the evolutionary ladder to less and less evolved organisms, what happens to that cerebrum in their brains? It gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Well, they're mammals, so they're pretty high up the ladder of. Yeah, I mean it's smaller, but in general it looks very much the same. But if you looked at a fish brain, for example, there's very little cerebrum there. The cerebellum's pretty big because fish have to be pretty coordinated, right? Cerebrum not so big, and we'll talk about some other parts in a minute that are much larger in a fish brain than in a human brain. But let's talk about a couple of other pieces on this picture. This part from about here down. That's called what? That's the brainstem. And in a fish, that part's really, really big. Sometimes it's called the primitive brain. Because what does that brainstem do for you? Yeah, it does the basic, keep you alive kinds of things. The most bottom part of this brainstem, right here, for example, what's that called? No? The very bottom part of the brainstem. It's got a cool name. The medulla oblongata. And it has all kinds of functions, but its most important function is controlling what? Heart rate. It has what's called the cardiac center. It controls your heart rate. This part, just a little bit above the medulla, it looks like a big tumor, but it's not a tumor. It's called what? Try again. That's called the pons. And that too has several functions, but probably its most important function, it has a system for controlling what? Breathing rate. Yes. Pons? P-O-N-S. A little bit higher up, not part of the brainstem, in this area of the brain right in here is a structure called the thalamus. I think we might have talked about the thalamus, the last one of these. You might think about the thalamus sort of like an old-timey operator. Or if you're watching the Andy Griffith show, Andy's trying to call Barney on the phone, and he calls, and he has to talk to the operator first, right? What did the operator do? Yeah, she had to connect the lines, essentially, between Andy and Barney or whoever else they were trying to call. That's sort of what your thalamus does. Let's say the information is coming in from your brain, from your eyeballs. It goes to the thalamus. The thalamus decides where to route that information. If it's information coming in from your eyes, where does it go in your brain, in your cerebrum? What part of your cerebrum deals with visual stuff? Turns out there's a back part back here. So things coming in from your eyeballs actually go back to the back of your brain, and that's where it gets processed. Things coming in from the right side of your body go to what part of your brain? The left side, and vice versa. It's the thalamus's job to do all that routing. It's like your body's operator.
You know how they say like some people are like right brain, left brain? They're like math people,
Right.
Really true. Are they really two separate
The cerebrum is in two halves. Now they're connected normally, and we'll talk about that connection in a second. I think the right brain, left thing is more of a human idea rather than a real thing.
Where this guy, he was really good at math because apparently like section of his brain where he did math like went to like section where he like blank so he could just do math.
That's cool. I mean, there's no doubt. Some of us are wired differently than others. There's no doubt. But the whole right brain, left brain thing, I think is more of a made-up thing than anything. But just below the thalamus, right in here, is what we call the hypothalamus, which means below the thalamus. Whenever you hear hypothalamus, you ought to think what one word? Homeostasis. It is the part of your brain that's like the NSA of your brain. It's watching everything. It's monitoring everything. Blood pressure, heart rate, blood sugar. And if any of those things get out of whack, out of kilter, what does it do? It sends out messages to fix it. And the cool thing about it is it can send out, two kinds of messages because of where it's at. Nervous, like electrical signals, or endocrine, because it's part of the hormonal system. Remember, it's like the emperor of the endocrine system. It's the boss. It can send out hormones to fix problems. It can send out electrical signals to fix problems. And then just below the hypothalamus, I've really got to put up the new projector so things show up a little bit better. I know it's kind of blurry up here. This little thing that looks sort of like a little peanut, that's the pituitary, which makes all kinds of hormones, such as what? Some hormones made by the pituitary. It's probably the most famous one. HGH, human growth hormone. It also makes ADH. Do you know what ADH does?
It makes you focus.
No, it's not related to ADHD. No. Anti-diuretic hormone, which cuts back on what? Urine. It helps you to conserve your body's water, to reabsorb water from your urine. It makes several other hormones like FSH. What does that stand for? Follicle stimulating hormone. It makes your sperm and your eggs develop. LH, which in you ladies causes what to happen? That causes you to ovulate. So there's all kinds of hormones coming from the pituitary, important ones. Another structure that we haven't mentioned since we talked about the endocrine system. I'm trying to move this box so we can see what we're doing there. Right back here, sort of in the middle, lower part of your brain, right in here, is this little thing called the pineal gland. Anybody remember what hormone that makes mostly? Pineal gland. makes a hormone called melatonin, which helps to control what? Sleep-wake cycle. Helps to control what rhythms in your body. Your circadian rhythms. Keeps you, when you're awake, when you're sleepy. Circadian rhythms. Melatonin from the pineal gland.
Why do they say that like your diet is gonna stop your energy if you like take those supplements?
That kind of stuff does happen. I mean, your body is conservative. So if you have something that you were making, there's no sense in making it anymore. It's kind of like a negative feedback loop. It's like these guys who get on steroids. It starts to go away. Yeah, you don't have to say that, but you get the idea. Parts of normally make those, right? That's the truth. Let's go just a little bit further here. Your cerebrum is sometimes divided up into lobes. You think of it in terms of lobes. So here's your cerebrum. Notice they're color-coded. We talked about the back part already. The back part, which is in these different shades of green back here in the back. That's called the occipital lobe. And it mostly handles visually related information. Processes visual stuff. In the back. That's why if you hit your brain, you hit your back of your head real hard, what do you see? Yeah, he's talking about seeing stars. Well, that part of your brain is being stimulated. It doesn't know where that stimulation, what that stimulation is, so what does it do? It just makes something up. Your brain does that a lot. Most of you have probably seen these little, not really puzzles, but you see these little things where they like have something written, and it's something obvious. It's something that everybody's familiar with, and they leave out a bunch of letters on purpose, and you read it, and you never even notice the letters aren't there. You guys ever done that before? Because your brain tends to fill in the gaps. Your brain makes up stuff. And that's how a lot of magician tricks work, right? Magicians doing something that everybody's familiar with. You stop paying attention to things because your brain just makes it up, and while you're not paying attention to things, they slide in something that you're not looking for. Some of that comes from your occipital lobe. The lobe that would be pretty near your ears is called the temporal lobe. That area does handle auditory stuff, hearing. But in addition, this is where a lot of your speech areas of your brain are at. In the temporal lobe, so hearing and speech. And other things. And I'm not completely saying that's the only stuff there. Some of the main things. The lobes of your brain that are sort of up here at the top, right in this area. Top, back, are called parietal. It's where you mean about taste. Notice it keeps talking about somatosensory areas. There's this little strip right in here called the somatosensory cortex. What would somatosensory mean?
Body sense.
Yeah, it's your body's sensations. For example, we know that this little stretch right in here, for example, is the part of the brain that interprets things that we feel in the trunk of our body, like right in here. This is the part of your brain that feels things that are happening to your arm. This is the part that feels things happening to your hand. How do they know that? How do they know the specifics of that?
I see where it lights up in the person.
That's when people were doing things like lobotomies. And when they do brain surgery, the person they're doing it on is what? Awake. They keep them awake so that they know they're okay. There's no pain receptors in the brain. So they start poking around on the brain, and when they poke on something, something happens. And they've learned what those parts do, in large part by doing brain surgery on awake people.
They still do lobotomies.
No.
Well, now can't they just like scan your brain and touch you somewhere and it'll like put a signal or something?
No, they didn't bother.
Maybe to some extent, but not quite. There you go. You got all the crazy Nazi scientists who were doing all kinds of weird research. Some of what we know about the brain comes from that kind of stuff, where they were doing cruel and crazy stuff to people. But I've got a diagram of that I want to show you of the somatosensory area. I may have to pull it up. Give me just a second. You might have seen this diagram in your textbook. It's kind of freaky looking. Let's pull up this one. Turn off the light so you can see a little bit better. So this is that little strip of the parietal lobe we were looking at. And notice how the body parts are in weird proportions here. Why are they proportioned the way they are in this diagram? Like, look how big the hand is and the face. Whereas the trunk of your body's really small. Yeah, this is trying to show you how much of that little strip is devoted to those different body parts. A big chunk of that somatosensory cortex is devoted to the hand, because you can feel all kinds of things with your hands, right? It's really sensitive. Your face, all kinds of sense receptors and stuff in your face. But your trunk, think about it. Can you really feel a whole lot with the trunk of your body? Not very sensitive. Not very sensitive at all. Your feet. Pretty big part associated with your feet. Your tongue. Compared to the actual size of your tongue, there's a lot of your brain associated with your tongue. That's trying to show you that different parts of the body essentially have different sensitivities because there's different sized parts of the brain associated with those parts. And that's the somatosensory cortex in your parietal lobe. Notice there is a very similar part of your brain devoted to motion, but that's in the front lobe. This is the frontal lobe. And in the very back part of the frontal lobe, there's what's called the primary motor areas. So this part of your brain right in here is what makes your leg consciously move. This makes your trunk consciously move. This makes your arm consciously move, your hand consciously move, your face consciously move. And notice how the part that feels what's going on in your face and the part that actually moves your face, they're very close together. Kind of makes sense. Hand to hand, arm to arm, trunk to trunk, leg to leg. The part that you feel with is the somatosensory cortex, and the part that you move with is the motor cortex. Notice the frontal lobe, though, that's where all kinds of important stuff like thought happen, motor to speech areas, all kinds of motor stuff, but memories. Frontal lobe is probably the most important lobe of your brain in terms of being human. And one other thing that I want us to look at before we go today, this thing back here. The stuff in blue is called the limbic system. Notice it sort of runs all through the back bottom part of your brain. What about that olfactory bulb? What's that? What's olfactory mean? Smell. Notice that compared to other mammals, what does our olfactory bulb look like?
Small.
It's really small. We kind of stink at smelling. Fish, for example, their olfactory bulb is huge. It's probably bigger than their cerebrum. The smell is really important for a fish to find food, not so much rest. But these things, all these pieces that are tied together here, help to control things related to your emotions. You ever notice that certain smells make you feel certain ways? Can affect your emotions, smells, yeah? This is why, because your sense of smell is tied into the part of your brain that controls your emotions. Back here in the back, the hippocampus, this kind of fat area back here in the back. not only is it related to emotions, but it's also related to converting short-term memories into long-term memories. You guys seen the movie 50 First Dates? I mean, that's a fictional movie, but that kind of thing actually happens. I have a documentary that I may show you after the AP exam, where a guy who was in law school at Oxford. Where's Oxford? In London. It's one of the best schools in the world, right? So to get into Oxford, you either have to be really, really smart or really, really rich. Well, this guy wasn't really, really rich. He was really, really smart. He was going to law school. He was in his 20s, and he had a stroke. Why? I don't know. I don't know what caused the stroke. But the stroke destroyed most of his hippocampus, which means he can't convert any new memories into long-term memories. So he woke up, he's okay, and everything that he knew before the stroke, he still knows. So he knows who he is, he knows his parents, he knows his friends, he knows where he lives. And he could come up and have a conversation here with Floyd, and they could become big buddies today, but he sees him tomorrow, he has no idea who he is. If you can't, think about computers for a minute. What's your short-term memory in your computer called? The RAM, right? When the power goes off in your computer, what happens to the RAM? It's gone. What we might think of as more the long-term memory, though, would be what? Sometimes, I'm thinking maybe more long-term than that, even like your hard drive. So we might think of a hard drive as your long-term memory. I know you guys are hung on every word I'm saying right now, and you remember it all, right? Every single word. But really what happens, you're taking all that information in, it's getting stored in your short-term memory. Your hippocampus will sort out what's important, all of it, what's not, none of it. And it will convert all that stuff that's important to long-term memory. And the short-term memory just gets erased like RAM. But people with a damaged hippocampus can't do that. So imagine what happens if say the house that this guy was living in, say, burned down. He wouldn't know how to get home. Because where he thinks home is not there anymore.
Well, so if he moved, he would be like all out of state.
Yeah, because he wouldn't know that he wouldn't remember that he moved. It would be a really weird thing. And like I said, I've got this documentary that kind of goes through the day in the life of this guy. I'll let you watch it at some point in time. It's really, really interesting, the problems that it causes. Last thing I'll mention. Somebody probably heard about this maybe in history. Anybody take psychology? There's this famous case where this guy was working on the railroad tracks. There was an explosion, and one of the railroad ties shot through his head. And it was sticking out. Both sides. And the guy's okay. They do surgery on him. They somehow get it out. I don't know how they got it out way back then, because this is 100 years ago or so. They get the railroad beam out of his head. He lives. He lives like 20 or 30 years after the accident. But what we know today is that it went through this limbic system, and it completely destroyed parts of this. By all accounts, the guy before the accident was a nice, friendly guy that everybody liked. Kind, thoughtful. What happened after that? He became as mean, grumpy, hateful, wanted to fight with people. It completely changed his whole demeanor because it destroyed parts of this limbic system, the parts that control personality, aggression, emotion. Kind of scary stuff. But anyway, it's a good place to stop. Guys, where's the sign-in sheet? There it is.